Hello and welcome. My name is Beyonce, and today we will be breaking down and discussing the third episode of season 1 of Sex and the City. Before we dive into the episode itself, I do have to give a slight spoiler here and say that this episode is the first one that has no storyline, dialogue, character introduction, or really anything from the book. So this will be our first venture into strictly breaking down the story without Candace Bushnell's words, which is kind of bittersweet, but we'll hear from her again very soon. Now, Bay of Married Pigs was directed by the Oscar-nominated Nicole Holofcener, a native New Yorker who will direct one more episode this season, and then 2 episodes in season 3. She's probably best known for writing and directing the films Enough Said from 2013, starring James Gandolfini and Julia Louis-Dreyfus, and Friends with Money from 2006, which starred Jennifer Aniston. Now, I may reference Friends with Money at some point in season 4, since the main character is one of 4 friends who's experiencing money problems. But it's kind of fun because I'm going to reference both Seinfeld and Friends during this breakdown. And Holofcener directed 2 stars from those respective series. In fact, she recently directed Julia Louis-Dreyfus again in You Hurt My Feelings. Anyway, this episode was written by Michael Patrick King. And let's talk about Michael Patrick King for a second because he's very important to Sex and the City lore. OMG, I just used the term lore. Am I trendy now? Yay. So, Michael Patrick King, whom I'll mostly refer to as MPK moving forward, joined Sex and the City as co-executive producer for the previous episode, which basically means that he and Darren Star were writing the episodes together. MPK will go on to be the showrunner for the 4th through final seasons, but he already had a pretty strong presence in television before joining Star. He wrote and produced 10 episodes of Murphy Brown and acted as a consulting producer for a few episodes of the first season of Will and Grace. Of course, following the finale of Sex and the City, MPK would write and produce the 2 Sex and the City movies and create And Just Like That. He also co-created one of my favorite TV shows, The Comeback, starring Lisa Kudrow, as well as 2 Broke Girls and AJ and the Queen, which everyone should go watch or else you're homophobic. It's on Netflix. By the way, totally just kidding about you being homophobic if you don't watch AJ and the Queen. Kind of. MPK also lives in Greenwich Village, which may be why we spend so much time there during this episode. But we open this episode on the New York City skyline, where we get a few nice views of the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building from across the East River, which I'm pretty sure these views are coming from Queens. We then pan over to the Edcotch Queensboro Bridge as Carrie tells us one of the best things about living in a city like New York is leaving it. She then leaves her apartment to head to the Hamptons, and we see the exterior of her apartment door for the first time. But the door next to hers isn't another apartment door, which is odd because she does have a neighbor who we'll meet later on in season 4. But this area right outside of her apartment will change a few times, so we won't dwell on it. But I do love that her casual nautical themed outfit is really all blue. It seems very appropriate for this trip, except for that bag. Like, it is a Vera Bradley bag, which is very much known for this kind of floral print, but everything else is so well coordinated color-wise, I guess I just expected more from Carrie. Anyway, Carrie's friend Patience and her husband Peter have invited Carrie up for the weekend, which it is important that Carrie qualifies the fact that her friend is Patience. We get the shot of the Hamptons general beachfront and not an actual exterior of a house, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then we meet Patience, played by Jennifer Guthrie, who will retire from acting after this role and virtually disappear. Her Wikipedia page does say that she's also in the 10th episode of this season, but that's not true. It's a totally different actress, which, like, I get it. I also think all white people look the same, but it's a totally different person. Also, her Wikipedia says that she played Elizabeth Shue's role of Chris Parker in the 1987 movie Adventures in Babysitting, so there you go. Peter is played by David Healy, and no, not Johnny Galecki's character on Roseanne. Healy has worked pretty consistently since this role, but nothing really of note. Most recently, he played the role of Doctor in season 12 of American Horror Story. But Carrie tells us that Patience and Peter were fun, smart, and they looked like they fell out of a J. Crew catalog. Which, yes, and why is it that married couples and parents on television automatically dress 10 years older than they are? Is it not weird that we assume these two are around the same age as Carrie, yet look so much older? Now, Carrie sings for her dinner by sharing an apparently very raunchy story about one of her sexual escapades. And I want to know what this story is because Peter's face while he's listening to it is unsettling. But speaking of unsettling behavior, we meet Carrie the next morning as she stretches and tells us she couldn't wait to go out and take in the spectacular view. She leaves her room, and we get our second predator in as many episodes. Only this time, Carrie is the victim of sexual violence and not someone else. Like, I wish I could tell you that this is our final encounter with the predator, but no. Does it get worse? That's a great question. Let's move on. So there are two weird things here. I know, only two. But the first is the fact that Peter seems like he may be unaware of his pantslessness, which I can pretty much guarantee he is aware. And the second is how long this encounter takes for Carrie to finally walk away from it. At least her facial expression is an appropriate response for once. But I'm going to talk a bit more about this during the season 1 retrospective, so I'm not going to dwell on this scene. Now, Patience comes home and Carrie tells her about the encounter, which is the correct thing to do. But Patience victim blames Carrie and kicks her out of the house, which is the incorrect thing to do. I do love this line though. Honey, did Carrie see your dick in the hall? Now, before we leave the Hamptons, I do want to touch on how ingenious the location manager, Seth Birch, was for this whole scene. So the reason that we don't get an exterior of Patience and Peter's house is because this wasn't filmed in the Hamptons. Quote, whenever possible, the producers strive to shoot within the 5 boroughs of New York City, even when the plotline takes place somewhere else. The Hamptons episode in season 1, when Carrie visits her married friends, was shot in a Manhattan brownstone. But the decor worked so well that you never would have guessed that we weren't in a beachfront house. So back in the city, Carrie meets the girls for lunch and they talk about what happened. Charlotte and Carrie can't seem to figure out why Peter did what he did, but I do think Samantha has the answer. Maybe he just wanted to show it off, like a monkey. Of course, since it's a gay man writing this episode, Samantha asks how big it was. And Carrie implies it's comparable to the peppermill. And I do love that the waiter, played by Remy Auberjonois, holds the peppermill in just the perfect place to really sell Samantha's joke and the subsequent reactions.
Oh, honey, I love some fresh pepper. In fact, I think everyone at this table could use a lot of fresh pepper.
Also, I'm in need of a lot of fresh pepper, by the way. Just saying. Anyway, dick jokes aside, we get to the main conflict of the episode, which is a conflict that will come up over and over again throughout the series. Carrie tells us that Patience told her she couldn't possibly understand what the big deal of the whole thing was because she's single. To which Miranda quips, and what? Single women prowl beach houses hoping for glimpses of their friends' husbands' dicks? I'm saying dicks a lot this episode. Anyway, Charlotte asks how good of a friend Patience was. Operative word, I think, being was. And my question probably would have been, how many times has Peter done this? Like, is this the first time Carrie spent the night there? Is she the first one who this has happened to? As in, is there a pattern of sexual violence from Patience's husband? But really, who cares? Because as Miranda points out, they become married and we become the enemy. It doesn't matter how long they've been friends, or even if they're good friends, which Patience obviously is not, if this was the first time they've talked about her. But we established two things here that will inform quite a few storylines for various characters. One being the Cold War between married people and single women. And then two, the fact that Miranda is apparently the only single lawyer at her law firm, which is incredibly difficult to believe, but let's go with it for now. Samantha also foreshadows some of her own future plot lines by telling us that married women are threatened by single women who can have sex with anyone. Face it, ladies, if you're still single, you're not to be trusted. We also get some pretty strong foundational indications of Charlotte as a character. She says she would never sleep with a married man, and she does the whole not all married women thing. To which Carrie says Charlotte treated marriage like a sorority she was desperately hoping to pledge. Now, I won't go into the trad wife trend bullshit right now, but here's a poster child for that toxic shit. It's like trad wife meets pick me. So, ew. But another fun thing that happens here is that we once again understand the sides. Miranda and Samantha versus Charlotte, with Carrie somewhere in the middle. But notice how Charlotte is never offended by Sam and Miranda not agreeing with her. She takes it all very much in stride and is kind of just like, oh, you two, you're incorrigible. We then get an exchange that will come up again, specifically in the season 4 opener. Miranda says, sure, the ones who don't fear you pity you. She then brings up the poor single you looks, and Charlotte acknowledges them, telling them how much she hates those looks when she's the only single one at a dinner party, and they all look at you like you're a blank. And then the women's responses to this fill in the blank say so much about their personalities. Carrie's worried about being a loser. Miranda feels like a leper. And Sam is worried about being perceived as a whore. Now, we don't get Charlotte's feelings, but if I had to guess, she would probably say something like outsider, or possibly just agree with Carrie. Also, is Carrie wearing a sweater tied around her bust? And are they all really eating the same salad? Like, is that a thing that people actually do? Also, Carrie is wearing a gold Bulgari watch, which she'll wear to her other lunch as well. And Charlotte is rocking a middle part this episode for some reason. I am indifferent about it, but I do think it's too edgy for Char. Also, Miranda's part is on the wrong side in this scene. Anyway, we come to Carrie's apartment so that she can work, and we see a few differences from the second episode to this episode. First off, the vases weren't there before. In their place was a framed picture. The teacup roses weren't there on the second shelf, and the bouquet of roses wasn't there either. It was actually on the table to the left of frame. Also, in the previous episode, there was a dish of some kind where the bouquet is now, and I'll point out some other weird things in the apartment later. But Carrie asks the quandary of the episode, is there a secret Cold War between marrieds and singles? And we also get the typing screen back, thank goodness. But then we go to the fourth wall breaking interviews, which are back for some reason. We begin with the person whom I will refer to as Ginger Homegirl. Ginger Homegirl says she loves her single friends, but they're far too pathetic for her to actually see. Because having your husband just stare at you like this is not desperate or creepy. By the way, I don't buy that they're married, or if they are, they're newlyweds. This doesn't seem normal to me. So basically, fuck Ginger Homegirl. Then we hear from the prototypical spinster, who I'm convinced is Charlotte from an alternate dimension where she never gets married, but I'll expand on that later. She tells us, I becomes we. We loved the movie. We hate that restaurant. We. And then we have some sports ball guy who says things about his friends, but it's interesting because he's standing somewhere near Light Street and Greenwich Street. I think it's on the corner of Vestry and Greenwich, but this whole area looks totally different now. We come back to Ginger Homegirl again, and her husband is still just staring at her. Like, he barely blinks. And I still hate her so much because really what she says here, like, is MPK secretly writing speeches for the GOP? Did I just start a new conspiracy? So we cut to Carrie and Stanford walking in Greenwich Village along University Place between 9th and 10th Streets, possibly coming from Gristetti's on the other side of 9th. They pass what looks like William Wayne and Co. gift shop, then Ilana Fine Jewelry, which I believe is now Madman Bakery, and then a store I can't quite make out, but it's now Doggy Style Grooming. Yeah, Greenwich Village is pretty queer, and I love it. But Stanford wears a plastic hat as he, for some reason, involves himself in this conversation. Now, while I do think that queer people are just as affected by this marrieds versus singles Cold War, I'm going to say things about this scene. In my controversial yet brave opinion, this entire scene just supports what I keep saying about it being very clear that gay men wrote this first season. So Stanford says, no, it's not a Cold War, it's an out-and-out battle. And it isn't just straight people. Every gay guy I know is running off to Hawaii, putting on a caftan, reciting vows, and feeling superior to me. Now, I'm not saying the sentiment is untrue, but this specific scene serves almost no purpose other than giving us an excuse to laugh at something that is probably pretty personal to MPK. I don't know for sure if MPK was single at the time he wrote this episode, but something tells me he was and probably experienced this scenario in some form. Stanford then says, now I'm just starting to feel like I'm an outcast in the outcasts. As soon as he says this, Joe and his life partner Lou walk up. Carrie hasn't seen Joe since he was straight / in Miss Saigon, which he is still in Miss Saigon and also okay straight. Like, yay, more by erasure. Now, for those who don't know, Miss Saigon is a sung-through stage musical, meaning there isn't any spoken dialogue. Everything any character says is sung through. So think of Hamilton versus Chicago. The musical is based on Giacomo Puccini's 1904 opera Madama Butterfly. Its book is by Claude Michel Schomburg and Alain Boublil, while its lyrics are by Boublil and Richard Maltby Jr. The musical takes place in Saigon during the Vietnam War, and it tells the tale of a tragically doomed romance between a Vietnamese girl and the American man who abandons her. Now, why Miss Saigon here? The only reason I can think of is that the show ran on Broadway from 1991 until 2001, meaning the start date is ambiguous enough that we don't know when Joe came out, which, by the way, is not the same as saying when he was straight. Again, the fucking 90s. But the show was still running in 1998, so he still had a job. The only other show I can immediately think of that he could have said is Cats. But I feel like even in 1998, New Yorkers had specific feelings about Cats. But honestly, Miss Saigon is way more controversial, so pick a side, I guess. Also, we're going to get another Miss Saigon reference in season 2 that will kind of hint to us exactly why it's so controversial. But let's move on. Joe is played by Peter Rini, who played a character named Frank in Sleepers a couple years before this, and he's been working pretty steadily following this role, including portraying Petey on 2 episodes of Smash and Jason Figueroa in 5 episodes of Orange is the New Black. Joe introduces Carrie and Stanford to his life partner, Lou, played by Lou Liberatore, who's probably best known for his role as defense attorney Dale Brody on Law and Order. Also, am I the only one who's so glad we don't have to use the term life partner anymore? Like, let's be honest, we never had to begin with, but still. Also, I think it's supremely annoying that they're basically wearing the same outfits, just with the black and white pieces swapped out. But then Joe asks Carrie a question that I don't understand. He's immediately like, "Are you married?" Even though he's the one who brought all of this up. Like, is that really the first question married people ask others? It feels a little invasive. But speaking of being invasive, they then seemingly just ignore all decorum and decency by asking Carrie to donate an egg despite not talking to her for years. Now, I do want to talk about this for a second because while MPK seems to think this is just hilarious and like it's an annoyance in his world as a single white gay man in 1998, in reality, this was and still is a huge issue for same-sex couples in the US. There are still states that are legally allowed to discriminate against and therefore refuse same-sex couples from adopting or becoming foster parents. This is why I don't understand Carrie's response here, calling it single bashing for the new millennium. Like, it's not like they said something like, "Hey, since you're single and obviously not using your eggs, can we steal one?" But again, this scene serves basically no purpose. Like, we don't bring up this donation question ever again, and we don't even see Stanford again this episode. As a matter of fact, we don't see him again until episode 7. But I digress. Let me know in the comments how you feel about this scene. Anywho, since we are on the streets of New York, let's see what else I found. So Carrie and Stanford walk up to the entrance of Whitney Chemist, a pharmacy at 50 University Place, which is still there. Next door was Fischera and Perkins Antique, which I believe is now the shop A Sustainable Village, which looks like a pretty cool place. Go visit them if you're in New York. They look like they're doing good things. We also see La Petite Coquette across the street as Carrie and Stanford are talking to Joe and Lou. La Petite Coquette was a boutique for lingerie and sleepwear. You can still order from them online, but that location is now the Grey Pearl, a home goods store. Bagel Bob's is still there, as is B&S Wines and Liquor. But strangely enough, behind Carrie and Stanny, when we first see them, are a Chase Bank and the restaurant Knickerbocker, which are both still there. Also, fun fact, Il Cantinori is just around the corner from here. Also, the bus that passes behind Joe and Lou has an ad on it for Tom Hanks Presents From the Earth to the Moon, an HBO miniseries produced by Ron Howard and Brian Glazer, among others, and which featured a lot of pretty big names at the time, including Tom Hanks, his wife Rita Wilson, Tim Daly, Carrie Elwes, and David Andrews. It actually aired before this episode aired, but it must have been a pretty happy coincidence that this was on the bus that passed them. By the way, David Andrews was in 7 episodes of Justified as Sheriff Tillman Napier, which starred Timothy Olyphant. So I get to keep my Timothy Olyphant streak alive. We then go to Miranda, getting ready for her law firm's annual sports ball game. Again, is this a thing? If so, this is the only year Miranda played, even though when a lawyer steals a base, he gets a promotion. Which, isn't it nice not always having to default to he pronouns to indicate a single person? Now, like everyone ever who went to Harvard, we all have to know about it. But as she's getting ready, Jeff comes up to introduce her to the person with whom he is setting her up. Jeff is played by H. John Benjamin, who is a prolific voice actor. He's the voice of Sterling Archer on Archer, Bob Belcher on Bob's Burgers, and he was the voice of the can of vegetables in Wet Hot American Summer, which featured Bradley Cooper, who we'll see next season. So Jeff tries to fix Miranda up with Sid, but before we get to that, is this what sports ball fields look like in cities? Just all dirt? Anyway, we come back to this whole Miranda is the only single person at her law firm thing, but like Jeff isn't wearing a wedding ring. Where's his life partner? Is he engaged? Is he in a serious relationship himself? Glass houses. That's all I'm saying. Now, Sid is played by Joanna P. Adler, who has been in a lot of stuff, but she's been in American Crime Story, the assassination of Gianni Versace as Andrew Cunard's mother, Marianne. She was in Orange is the New Black as Chaplain Royce, Tick Tick Boom with my actual husband, Andrew Garfield, and Divorce, which starred Sarah Jessica Parker. So Miranda has to come out of the closet as not a lesbian, but I do have to say it is nice that Jeff assumes she's a lesbian only because he's never seen her with a man at a firm function. Like, if it were my bitchy ass, I'd probably say something really offensive, like, I don't know, maybe it's your Ellen DeGeneres haircut, or you're about to play a softball game. God, good thing I'm in control of my intrusive thoughts. Speaking of stereotypes, though, is this why we're playing a sports ball game? Like, so they can just be a stereotypical lesbian couple? Also, why is Sid even playing if she's not part of the firm? Anyway, Sid and Miranda do good sports ball, and they're laughing together about how good they both are at softball, which...
Am I right? Lesbian! We're all thinking it, aren't we?
I am so sorry. I let the intrusive thoughts win. But now that Miranda's seemingly in this relationship, Chip, finally acknowledges her presence. And this is why I hate working for men. But before we move on, Chip's wife is wearing what is probably a Ralph Lauren blazer with a Versace scarf, which is a fascinating combination. There's something kind of off about it, which makes sense since the Stepford wife doesn't say a word here. But Chip invites the couple to a dinner party, and Miranda agrees. We come back to Carrie's apartment, where she and Miranda eat out of Pier 1 Imports bowls and discuss the very obvious reason Chip invited her to the dinner party, because she's in a couple. As Miranda points out, he seemed so relieved to have finally figured me out. So Miranda leaves, and we catch a glimpse of Carrie's shoes she was wearing today, which are clogs.
She could be a farmer in those clothes.
Like, I'm sorry, but between the clogs and all of the freaking hats, I'm barely keeping it together. But before we leave Carrie's apartment, here are a few more changes that I noticed from the previous episode. Starting with the lamp, they moved over to the left on the entry table. They also moved the blue frame on the fridge to her second shelf above the C. They removed some of the books on top of the fridge and just left The Joy of Cooking, which why Carrie doesn't even cook. And they added the striped frame and tray where the bowl was. They moved that weird cherub magnet over, and they have these frames on the table along with this weird clown thing. Like, I don't know what's happening or what they're trying to do here, but I do feel like we're a Kathy comic on the fridge away from being Caroline in the city. I'm also pretty sure we're never going to see this bench again. Now, Carrie decides to infiltrate the enemy camp by having lunch with her favorite couple, Lisa and David. And can I just say, I'm very glad that we get a pretty dramatic reduction in the number of couples that we have to endure after this episode. Now, Lisa is played by Stephanie Vendito, who was not in very much after this. She was in one episode of ER, but ER was basically the Grey's Anatomy of the 90s and 2000s. Like, everyone was on it. David is played by John Gleason Connolly, who also wasn't in a ton after this, but he did portray Hugh Hefner in 3 episodes of Masters of Sex. Now, David is almost attractive, except for that haircut and the silver bracelet from the Mr. T collection. Yes, another Friends reference. Like, are married men even allowed to wear a bracelet like that? And also, are they newlyweds? I bet they're newlyweds based on this banter. I'm also incredibly distracted by the not eating thing that David is doing here. Like, look at that noodle on his fork. And this happens twice. Anywho, I want to know exactly what Carrie asked them right before this because this banter is so rom-com. It feels very unnatural, which is probably why MPK was single, allegedly. Now, Carrie tells us more about when she hates being single for the 3rd time this episode. But then David asks her if she wants to get married someday, to which Carrie says, I'm beginning to think I may not be the marrying kind, which, spoiler alert, is some very strong foreshadowing. She even says in the narration, no sooner had the words come out of my mouth than I wondered if they were true. But actually, no sooner had the words come out of her mouth than Lisa and David stopped being her favorite couple because in walks Sean. They invite him to join them for dessert, but wait, what? They're about to get dessert? They're eating one noodle at a time. Anyway, I hate Lisa and David so much right now. By the way, if you're in a couple and think to yourself, hey, I'll do a surprise fix-up for my single friend, don't do that. No wonder we never see Lisa and David again. But it actually gets worse for poor Carrie, because at some point Sean says, my parents met on a fix-up, and they will be married 41 years next month. To which I say, run away immediately, Carrie. Now, Sean is played by Scott Rabinowitz, who was also not in much following this. And luckily, Carrie quickly understands what is happening. It was then I realized I was having coffee with the marrying guy, that elusive and rare Manhattan man whose sights were set on marriage. Now, the marrying guy doesn't come from the book per se, but we do get a peculiar character named Tom Perry in Chapter 3, We Loved a Serial Dater. Tom Perry is 43 years old, 5 feet 10 inches tall, with straight brown hair. There is nothing remarkable about his appearance, save for a penchant a few years ago for dressing in black Armani suits paired with wacky suspenders. He comes from a wealthy manufacturing company and grew up on Fifth Avenue and in Bedford, New York. He lives in a modern high-rise on Fifth Avenue. Over the last 15 years, Perry, who is almost always referred to by his last name only, has become something of a legend in New York. He's not exactly a womanizer because he's always trying to get married. Perry is rather one of the city's most accomplished serial daters, engaging in up to 12 relationships a year. But after 2 days or 2 months, the inevitable happens. Something goes wrong, and he says, I got dumped. Obviously, Sean isn't as pathetic as Perry, but we do still wonder why it is that Carrie agrees to see him again. Speaking of, over the next week and a half, they see 2 movies at this movie theater that we'll talk about later. But we see the posters for City of Angels and US Marshals. Now, I've decided that the first time they saw City of Angels, and then Carrie was like, oh, another movie? Let's see US Marshals. Right? The least romantic of the two. City of Angels is a 1998 romantic drama fantasy movie starring Meg Ryan and Nicolas Cage. She plays a surgeon named Maggie who's good at her job but gets too emotionally attached to her patients, which causes her anguish. He is an angel. Hold on, stay with me. He's an angel who meets her and falls in love with her. He then learns that he can become a human to be with her, so he does. Now, the movie itself is honestly so-so. I haven't seen it in years, and I'm okay with that. But the soundtrack is pretty awesome. Like, Hello, Iris by the Goo Goo Dolls, Uninvited by Alanis Morissette, Angel by Sarah McLachlan, and Feel in Love by Paula Cole. And I've never actually seen US Marshals, but apparently it's a sequel slash spinoff of The Fugitive, which never needed a sequel, right? But I do love the idea of Carrie picking this movie just so she doesn't have to be all lovey-dovey with Sean. I'm also going to talk about these being the movie choices for the theater later, but wow, Carrie is just not into this guy at all. Like, those are not date night outfits. They then go shopping together at Williams Sonoma for a cheese grater, which is so romantic. I'm guessing they went to the Columbus Circle location, if that location was open then, since they're walking along the west side of Central Park near 67th Street. And it's a nice touch that Sean is carrying a Williams Sonoma bag, but Carrie wins because she's wearing a Hanson t-shirt. Yeah, Hanson, the pop band that had just released MMMBop the year prior. Like, where did Carrie even get this t-shirt? Now, Sean invites Carrie and her friends to his housewarming party, also on the 12th, and then leans in for what looks like their first kiss. And Carrie keeps her eyes open the entire kiss, while she tells us he was like the flesh and blood equivalent of a DKNY dress. You know it's not your style, but it's right there, so you try it on anyway. Which I'm not sure why we had to throw Donna Karen under the bus, but I've been there, so same girl. Keep those eyes open. Like, what exactly did they talk about on these dates? No wonder she had him go to so many movies. So we get to the night of the 12th, and I don't know what is up with these timelines. Like, do people need weeks to plan a dinner party? It's been at least a week and a half since the sports ball. Anyway, on the east side, a pseudo-lesbian couple attended a right-wing Republican dinner party, which is one of the most terrifying sentences ever said in a TV show. Also, in these outfits, did Miranda pick the most lesbian-looking thing she could find? Anyway, they walk through this very extra hallway, up to the door, and oh no, they link arms as they approach the door. But like, why is Sid here? What is she getting out of this? And will Miranda ever go to a dinner party that doesn't begin with deception and end with a confession? Anyway, on the west side, the other 3 arrive at Sean's housewarming party, where Carrie strongly denies that Sean is her boyfriend, which just makes me wonder what information Carrie has shared with these 2 thus far. Like, they were just in a cab together. What did Carrie tell them about Sean? Anyway, before they enter the apartment, that door is definitely already open. But as they do enter, we get a better look at each dress. Samantha is back in a plunging neckline, which just looks so good on her, as does this color, which is not an easy one to pull off. She'll actually wear something similar to this a few times, but I really like this dress. It's not over the top, but it's very sexy. Charlotte also looks very housewarming party appropriate in this red dress. And Carrie is once again in a little black dress. But her hair looks fabulous like this. Now, they find out that all of Sean's friends are couples, which again, terrifying. Like, I bet he read the same book that Charlotte reads in season 3. Anyway, Sam is pissed, as I would be, so she goes to the kitchen to drink, where she starts talking to this very fun looking guy about stocks before his wife comes to take him away. Apparently, Carrie is the only one figured out. But Sean takes Carrie and Charlotte on a tour, ending in the den, which has an Apple Multiscan 15AV display, so no more gateway for us. It also has a mushroom coppersmith table lamp from Michael Lamp, and Sean tells us he's using the den as an office for now, but that it's supposed to be for the kids' room in the future. Wow. And then, as if the pleated pants weren't bad enough, Sean pulls out this creepy ass mobile with baby heads attached to wings. Like, I get it, they're supposed to be cherubs, but even that is kind of creepy for someone like Carrie. Like, cherubs are supposed to represent the presence of God or divine beings, which is very not Carrie. Hence my problem with her having a cherub on her fridge. Was that supposed to give us some false hope that Sean may be the one? Also, it's weird that Charlotte and Sean match, right? Like, at least she and Carrie are reacting to all of this appropriately. Because just, wow. Now, Carrie meets back up with Samantha, who has moved on to tequila shots, which, again, same girl. Samantha points out the men at the party she slept with, saying, I never thought I'd see them again. To which Carrie replies, maybe we should start tagging your married men, and that way you can keep track of them. Which is a little judgmental, but luckily Sam doesn't seem to notice. Charlotte comes up and tells Carrie no guy buys a classic 6 on the Upper West Side unless they are seriously thinking about marriage. I've always just been like, okay, sure, makes sense to this, but I decided to understand what this actually means. So according to City Realty, classic nods to the pre-war era when apartments of this ilk were built, and 6 refers to the total number of rooms, which must include a living room, a formal dining room, a kitchen, 2 full bedrooms, and a maid's room, typically located near the kitchen and with its own bath. Samantha responds to this with, if you turn into one of those married assholes, I'll kill you. So again, some really deep foreshadowing. I think that by freeing the writing of this episode from the book, MPK and Darren Star freed themselves up to really start exploring not just the personalities of the characters, but the desires and motivations of each. Carrie talks to some of Sean's friends, including that bitch of a wife, whose name is Elaine in the credits. She's played by Isabel Gillies, who's probably best known for her role as Kathy Stabler in Law & Order SVU. But seriously, how do Sean's friends know how much money he has in the bank? Is this a common thing that white people know? Now, my second favorite quote of the episode comes up here. We both slept with him, and he is great in bed. I only love this quote so much, though, because of the tall one's reaction to it. Like, yeah, same girl. What? Charlotte's going to try to get a very drunk Samantha home, but that's when more friends come up, and of course it's Patience and Peter. Carrie introduces Samantha to them, and we get my favorite quote of the episode, Big Peppermill Dick. And let's be honest and rank who's the most wrong in this situation, because no one's completely innocent here. Obviously, Peter is the most wrong, but following pretty closely is Patience, who handled the entire situation horribly. Carrie is definitely the least wrong in this situation. Like, of course she told her girlfriends that she was flashed by her friend's husband. So really, Patience can just wipe that injured puppy look off her face, okay? If you can't handle the scuttlebutt, get the hell out of Carrie's life. Also, side note, it's insane to me that Miranda and Peter have the exact same haircut. So Miranda and Sid leave the dinner party, and Miranda comes out as not a lesbian for the second time this episode, which probably ruins her chances of a promotion at the law firm. That's not okay, so Miranda has the correct reaction to Chip's disappointment. But then we're like, Miranda considered how much easier her life would be if she were in a couple, any couple. So she attacks Sid, which, okay, it doesn't need to be that serious, but consent is sexy, y'all. Then Miranda says, yep, definitely straight. And Sid replies, yeah, you are. And I'm pretty sure lesbians get a kick out of this, but what does that mean? We already know Miranda's a bad kisser thanks to that painful makeout scene with Skippy, but I don't get it. Also, before we leave the pseudo lesbian couple, I do need to point out how strange it is that Sid is also wearing a Versace scarf. Like, did she put it on purpose because the Stepford wife had it on? And even if that's the case, she put it on under a trench coat? I do also have to say, before we move on, that this whole plotline for Miranda feels very much like the strange trope that emerged in the 90s of writers making sure we all know that the quasi-gay character is in fact straight. Like the Chandler could get a Brian episode, or the not that there's anything wrong with that episode on Seinfeld, which is still one of my favorite episodes of that show, or even the many episodes where Frasier and or Niles need to assure their heterosexuality. Like, I'm not going to dive into this since we don't have the time, but YouTuber Matt Baum has a lot of videos on this topic, so you should check out some of his analyses. So moving on to Charlotte bringing Samantha home to her apartment so she can make sure Sam is safe, which is so sweet. And as they enter the building, Sam points out how cute the doorman is, which I have to agree. The doorman Tommy is played by Carl Geary, an Irish actor who's best known for his role as Horatio in the 2000 film Hamlet, which also starred Kyle MacLachlan. Samantha escapes and comes to get Tommy, and I do have to say, Kim Cattrall acting drunk is one of the best ever. Also, I'm a bit jealous of how she can just go up and get Tommy to go upstairs with her so easily. Like, good for her. And I do love that she has sex with Tommy, not to validate herself this time, but just because she thinks he's cute. They're finally just letting her have sex like a man. Sure, she gets treated like a whore at the party, but fuck those marrieds. Charlotte gets woken up by Tommy leaving the apartment, which doesn't sound correct. Spoiler alert, Sam is a screamer. But we do get our first look at Charlotte's bedroom and apartment. Of course, it's all ivory, cream, and white. I love the roses next to her bed, but those would kill me because of my allergies. And just like Carrie's apartment, we'll see a few changes here and there to Charlotte's apartment, but it actually stays pretty consistent throughout this season. But talk about jealousy, let's try to look more closely at Charlotte's bookshelf, or probably more accurately, built-in. Now, I was only able to figure out a few of the titles, but we do have a book on Lyubov Popova, the Russian-Soviet avant-garde artist, painter, and designer who died in 1924. We also have 1981's Century by Fred Mustard Stewart, and what is most likely American Civilization by editor Daniel J. Borston. The spine is different here, but it might just not be a first edition. But like, seriously, I'm so jealous of this collection. But these books are the reason I'm convinced the spinster is an alternate dimension future Charlotte. She also has a bunch of books behind her, which include a book on Claude Monet, which I'm not going to find this specific one because there are a million books about him, Donatello and his world, and a book on the Renaissance behind her head. Also, I love how Tommy opened her bathroom door for her. Tommy is precious. So we go back to Sean's apartment after the party is over, and all of the guests have just left their glasses all over the place. Like, who are these people? Also, did Sean seriously not get the party catered or anything? Like, ugh, how pathetic. At least they got him presents though, right? Speaking of awkward things in his apartment, what is up with the framed pieces of wallpaper acting as art? Does Sean watch a lot of HGTV DIY shows? Hopefully there's some better art in one of those boxes, although it doesn't look like it since those boxes are pretty tiny. Also, that's a lot of candles lit for a rather crowded party. Anyway, Carrie dumps him, telling him that she was just trying him on, and then Sean ventures dangerously close to incel territory with his desperation, but at least Carrie doesn't vomit while trying this married guy on. But she does have the admittedly brilliant idea to set him up with Charlotte, who actually wants to get married. Unfortunately, when they visit China, which I love Carrie's puns in this show, we get one of the most Charlotte-y Charlotte moments. Only Charlotte can dump a guy because of his taste in China. And I'll be honest, I know nothing about China patterns, but this distinction between American classic and French country may just come down to a gaudy palette and pattern versus a more neutral one. Like Sean picks out this Grimaldi pattern by Mikasa, which next to it is the Maxima Grimaldi pattern, which is definitely Maxima and ugly. Like I said, hi Gotti. We can compare those to the French country ones that Mikasa sells, and you see what I mean. So after the breakup, Charlotte walks up to her building, which gives us a better glimpse of the exterior. It looks like this is 275 Central Park West, and they probably put a bush in front of the building to hide the plaque that's there. But you can see the entrance to the 86th Street subway station behind her, as well as the awning for 279 Central Park West, which is a condominium building. So we pass poor Tommy, but let's not forget that Sam has sex like a man, and we've all been here. So it's not nice, but it's at least a role reversal from all of the "we had sex and you never called me" tropes for male characters that behave this exact same way. Like, think of Joey from Friends, or Barney Stinson from How I Met Your Mother, or Sam Malone from Cheers. But let's save this topic for the retrospective. So Carrie walks down the sidewalk thinking about this Cold War and compares it to the Troubles of Northern Ireland, which was a very violent 30-year conflict that is way oversimplified here. But with MPK being an Irish American Catholic, I'm not going to dwell on this fact. Instead, I'll agree with Darren Starr's sentiments about this final scene. There's a point at the end of the episode where, after the girls have gone on their separate adventures, they meet up at a movie theater and walk in with their arms around each other. There was a believable sense of warmth and camaraderie that allowed us to go to the more outrageous extremes. No matter what kind of adventures these girls go on, they're able to come back to the group, recollect themselves, and touch base. So that's all well and good, but I have a lot to dissect here before we wrap things up, starting with this theater. So this movie theater used to be Art Greenwich on the corner of Greenwich Avenue and West 12th Street, which showed up as the Alex Theater in the season 7 Seinfeld episode, The Gum, in 1995. Unfortunately, this is now an Equinox Club. Another thing I do want to talk about is our movie selection during this episode. So City of Angels, U.S. Marshals, and this one here, Quest for Camelot, are all Warner Brothers movies, at least as far as distribution goes. The 1998 Godzilla movie is not. It's a TriStar Pictures movie. So why is it here if HBO is part of the Warner Brothers company? I can pretty confidently say that Sarah Jessica Parker had something to do with it, since her husband, Matthew Broderick, is the star of the awful movie. Like, seriously, it's a horrible movie. I watched it again recently, thinking we were maybe too harsh when it first came out, but no, it's just really bad. Which brings us back to the timeline I mentioned earlier. So Carrie and Sean first walked up to City of Angels and U.S. Marshals on display. U.S. Marshals was released on March 6th, 1998, while City of Angels was released to theaters a month later on April 10th. Like, maybe this theater chose to keep U.S. Marshals and not replace it with Titanic, which was the top box office film for 15 weeks and grossed over $1 billion. But fine. Carrie and Sean went to the movies like mid-April. Quest for Camelot, another movie I've never seen, but it's okay, I'm not the only one, was released on May 15th, 1998, while Godzilla was released on May 20th. So essentially this episode spanned at least a month, which I don't think is going to happen again until the final season. I'm also convinced that all of these posters were filmed prior to the movie's releases, so no one knew how badly Godzilla and Quest for Camelot would perform. Just real quick before we move on, in what world does it make sense that these four women are going to go see Godzilla? Like, are they teenage boys? Just know your audience, Zilla. Now, one final thing before we officially wrap things up. We close the episode with Aretha Franklin's Respect, which was first released in 1967 and is one of my favorite songs by my second favorite artist of all time. But why? Like, the song is tangentially connected to the plot of the episode, but barely. Like, sure, this is a feminist anthem, but at its core is a woman in a relationship who's demanding respect from her man. I think this is another example of them not fully knowing what they wanted to do with the production of the show and therefore experimenting with things to see what works, which is very common. But I think the changes to Carrie's apartment, the styling of this episode, such as all the damn hats and the clogs and sneakers, and the pointless scene with Stanford are all really indicative of this. Again, this is the first episode that had basically zero elements from the book, so there was a lot more freedom for MPK, which meant more freedom for director Holofcener to try some things, for better or for worse. So let's wrap this up with a little bit of analysis, starting with the title, Bay of Married Pigs, which we get plenty of married pigs here. We have Peter and Patience, Chip, arguably Joe and Leo, and SJP for shamelessly promoting her husband's terrible movie. We also get some great character development outside the book, as well as some pretty intense foreshadowing for future episodes and seasons. Weirdly enough, we don't get any sex this episode. Like, sure, Samantha keeps her streak alive by sleeping with Tommy, but the only person we get actually in bed is Charlotte being woken up afterward. And Carrie when she writes, but I don't think that counts. But let's do a quick check-in on our BIPOC character count. Now, I did forget to add Misha in the previous episode. She did only say thank you, but I'm going to count it. So we're at 2. And speaking of characters, this is the first episode, and thank goodness not the last, that doesn't have Big at all. But that is the full breakdown and discussion of the third episode of Sex and the City. Please like the video if you enjoyed it, and be sure to subscribe to the channel if you have not yet. And I will see you next time.